Hi everyone, and welcome. This is a massive compilation of almost kidnapped stories. If you have your own almost kidnapped story, you can send it at southerncannibal.com, as well as any other kind of scary story you may have. I hope you all enjoy the stories, and if you're new, welcome. Without any more interruptions, let's go ahead and get started. And remember to always stay hungry. I'm choosing the real names of the locations in my story so that if anyone wants to see a roadmap of the scenario, they can. A few years ago in 2019, when I was 25 years old, I was living in an apartment in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Every weekend, I would visit my parents and my friends all back home in Jefferson. This night, I was hanging out with one of my friends and decided to head back to Milwaukee, seeing it was almost midnight, and I wanted to get back before I got too tired. As I was driving there was some really bad fog by the time I got to Johnson Creek, and I was too worried about taking the interstate back to Milwaukee, but I also didn't want to head back, as I could barely see a full-length car in front of me. So I decided to go to the 24-hour truck stop diner called Pinecone. I figured I would eat slowly, play on my phone, and wait until the fog got better. Pulling up at the place was pretty empty, aside from the trucks parked in the semi area and the few employee cars parked out back. Because of this, I was able to pull in right up to the building, next to the disabled parking by the door. This I now figure is one of the main reasons I'm still here. Everything was pretty normal inside. I got my food, played with my phone, and I tried not to fall asleep. I took occasional glances outside to check on the fog. It stayed pretty thick the whole night. A few customers came and went, mostly truckers just getting a meal before sleeping in their semis. Otherwise, nothing of note really happened. It got to about 4 a.m. when I couldn't really handle staying awake. I decided to make my way back to Jefferson to my parents' house to sleep until the fog lightened up. Because I was so tired, I didn't notice other people because my focus was to get to my car so that I could leave. I quickly made my way to my car, which was close to the doors. I was sitting in my car, and I had already turned it on, when a lady started knocking in my window. I rolled down the window a crack and prepared to use my usual line of, "Sorry, I don't have any extra cash on me," because I assumed she was going to ask me for change or something. Instead, she said she needed my help. She then told me a story about how her and her husband were driving for a while, and a white van kept following them. That they pulled into the parking lot of Pinecone, and the van was still following. She said that she was scared to walk back to her car because the van was right next to it, and she wanted me to walk with her. Before I go into the shadiness of her story or my current mental state, let me talk about her appearance. She was a thin woman, apart from being very visibly pregnant. Also, when she was telling me her story, she didn't even sound frightened. It sounded almost void of emotion. That, along with her wide eyes staring me down, was really freaky. Now, one thing to know about me: when I'm really tired, I can be very blunt and stubborn, which I suppose is the second reason I'm still here. Her story didn't add up. Number 1, where was her husband? Number 2, why did she get out of her car if there was a van following her? Number 3, what did she expect me, a 5'2", 25-year-old girl, to do to help? Number 4, honestly, I was just too tired to think of the obvious, but why not call the police? My response to her was, "No, I'm not getting out of this car. You want help? Go get your husband or the employees here to help, because I'm not going to." She literally just stared at me for like a solid 15 seconds before saying okay and then walking away into the parking lot. I pulled out and I made my way home. No one followed me, thankfully. My parents were awake because before I went out to my car, I then messaged them that I was coming back to the house. My parents have a really hard time sleeping if they don't know I'm safe, being that I was unable to get to Milwaukee due to the roads that were already up. I then told them the whole story. I figured that Pinecone can easily be a hub for trafficking due to it being open 24 hours and right off the interstate. The windows for the area I was seated in were very large and illuminated, so they could have been scoping me out for a while. Due to all the fog and lack of lighting outside, I don't think I would have noticed them. They were probably hoping I was parked in the main parking area so that the lady could have gotten me halfway to the car. I was very lucky that night. I eventually made my way back to my apartment in Milwaukee, but I will never go back to Pinecone alone at night ever again. This is how I was almost kidnapped at 14 years old. For some background, I live in a small neighborhood that is pretty notorious for its crime rate. It was me and another girl who I'll refer to as A. Me and A were walking down an alleyway that would lead us to a street near our homes. It was long, and it had a field on one side and gardens on the other. A man stood in the field watching us walk past, and he just stared at us. He didn't move, nor did he blink. Once we were by the exit, he charged at us. Me and A then started hiding. Yeah, I know this was stupid, but he was a lot faster than us, and the exit was another minute or two away. He didn't see us hide, and as he ran, he was looking around, very confused as to where we went. He left the alleyway, and he slowed his pace. Me and A decided to wait just a few minutes before leaving our spot. Once we got out, we noticed a blue Ford with no license plate. The windows were all duct taped, apart from the front one, and the back doors were slightly open. We thought this was suspicious, but we carried on walking. Well, someone in the car noticed us, and they then opened the doors even more. The car then reversed towards us at full speed, with the door still opening. Me and A started screaming and running, going to the nearest garden, banging on someone's door. The car then quickly sped off, making a screeching sound. The person at the house never answered the door, so me and A then ran to my house. We eventually made it to my house, and I ended up vomiting from the nerves, and I couldn't stop shaking. I just know the person in the car was the same man from that field. I just know it. I never went down that same alleyway ever again. And now every time I see a small beat up car, I always get shivers just thinking about what could have happened to us. Whenever I go alone, I always look over my shoulder. I'm a 22-year-old female, by the way. This happened about 10 or 11 years ago. I live in Ohio, and in our town, sex trafficking is huge. Anyways, when I was around 11 years old, I was at my grandma's house with my two younger brothers. At the time, my youngest brother was 1, and my other brother was 9. My 9-year-old brother and I used to ride our bikes all around town in different neighborhoods. Whenever my grandma watched us, she always made sure that we checked in every once in a while. Bless her heart, but she still isn't that great at babysitting, because we mainly just did whatever we wanted, and we never did ask or tell her where we went or what we were doing. Anyways, my brother and I were about a mile away in the parking lot near the neighborhood my grandma lived in. We used to pretend that we were driving cars and then park in the parking spaces. We noticed a green van, and the guy inside of it waved to us. Not too long after that, we shortly left to go check in and go grab a snack at my grandma's. Well, after the latest check-in, I was ready to get back on my bike and ride, but my brother didn't want to go back out. So I decided to go on my own and go solo. I rode past the parking lot again, and that van was still there. I took note of it, but I continued on. It started getting dark now, and I was starting to get hungry for dinner, so I started making my way back to my grandma's house when I rode past the same parking lot, and I saw the same green van from before still in the parking lot. I thought it was strange, but kept on. A few moments later, I had heard a car coming up behind me and decided to move closer to the grass so that I didn't get hit. I noticed the green van coming up from behind me, and when I noticed him, he then began honking at me. I thought that since he was honking, he wanted me to get out of the way. So I pulled up to a four-way stop, and I then stopped so that he could go on. He then stopped, and he motioned for me to come to his vehicle, and I became physically sick from that. Now, my father's a police officer, and at the time, I knew all the warnings of kidnappers and human traffickers. I immediately started riding my bike so hard, and I took different back roads because I didn't want him to know where I was going home to. I was always told to pull into the driveway if someone's following you, because 9 times out of 10, they'll stop following you. I was almost at my grandmother's house, but because of the fear of him catching me, I then pulled into a driveway just a street over, and I tried to get off my bike because I wanted to knock on the door. This guy then pulls into the driveway and parked it, and he went to open the door. I stayed on my bike, and I drove through the yard into the backyard of this house, got back on the road, and I then booked it to my grandparents' house. I was almost there, and he was trailing behind me again. I finally pulled into my grandma's driveway, flung my bike off me, and I ran to the front door, and I then watched through the screen door as he pulled in, backed out, and then turned around. He then went by the house 3 or 4 times before I didn't see him again. For whatever reason then I can't really remember, I never did tell my grandma or grandpa about it. I just went inside and ate dinner, and I sat in the room, thinking about all the weird possibilities of what could have happened. So it's now the next day, and my brothers and I were playing with chalk on the driveway, when I then heard honking. I look up, and it's the same green creepy van from before. The guy went by the house multiple times until I finally made my younger brothers go inside with me, and we just watched TV for the rest of the day. Thankfully, nothing else ever happened after that. I'm gonna be 23 coming this Saturday, and I'm now married with a baby of my own. And because of the several traumas that I've gone through myself, I'm 100% going to be a helicopter mom. I thank God all the time for protecting me to this day. I'm really glad I got away unscathed. This happened in 2000 to 2001. I was about 19 or 20. I lived in a large apartment complex with my dad and brother. My mom lived in the complex with a roommate, but on the opposite end of this complex. Her apartment was near a 10-minute walk. One night my mom decided to do her laundry really late at about 11:30 to 12:30 in the evening. She was at her nearest laundry room all alone, and she called me to come keep her company so that she wouldn't be alone at night. I agreed, and I walked across the apartment complex to go hang out with her. I didn't realize how cold it was until I was sitting with her for a few minutes and decided to walk back home to grab a hoodie. On my way back home to my apartment, I had noticed a figure walking and keeping pace to me on the opposite side of the gated pool that was to the right of me along the path that I was on. I couldn't necessarily decipher features or the clothing. It was just a figure walking. Like I said, he or she was on the opposite side of the gated pool, so they must have been about 20 to 30 feet away from me. Now, I know enough to be aware of my surroundings at all times, so I made sure to keep an eye on them, but at the same time, I just figured it was someone walking home to their apartment nearby, or maybe they were leaving. It's a large apartment complex, and although late at night, it's not uncommon for people to be out walking or coming or going, so I wasn't too worried about them. However, again, I was staying aware. After we passed the pool, the path connected, and I saw the figure had turned to their left, and they began walking towards me. This alerted me, and I was still keeping track of them, and I noticed the shape resembled about an average-sized man. I still couldn't see features on their face, but the body build resembled about an average height/build of a man. I started walking faster as they were going to be behind me very soon. I get to a split in the path and I turned right. At this point, I've probably been walking for about 6 to 8 minutes, and I was now very close to home. My apartment was only 2 units away. I looked behind me, and the figure was still behind me. They turned right as well, and they were getting closer now. I get to my apartment, and I'm now jogging at this point. I get to my door, and even though they turned right behind me, they didn't pass my apartment door. They either walked another direction, or vanished, or maybe they just got home. At least, that's what I was trying to convince myself. My heart was pounding, but I was still trying to convince myself that it was just another resident walking home, or maybe they were going to work or something. I then immediately asked my brother to go look outside and see if he saw anyone. I quickly filled him in on the person that I felt may have been following me. So he went outside for a minute, came back in, and he said he didn't see anyone. That was a huge relief for me. I convinced myself that it was just another resident out late like me. I should have asked my brother to also walk me back to the laundry room, because as soon as I reached that same pool halfway through my walk, I saw the same dark figure appear on the opposite side of the gated pool yet again, and I couldn't believe it. All these thoughts were racing in my head. Is it the same person? Or is it someone else? Am I being followed, or am I just being paranoid? My heart was racing. I didn't allow myself to reach the end of the pool and have our walkway paths meet again. I took off to the right off the path behind some apartment units to try to get to my mom at the laundry room faster. I'm jogging behind these buildings and cutting through some trees and shrubbery. I maybe cut my walk by about 2 to 3 minutes, and I see another walking path and get back on it. I'm right behind a building, and I see another fork in the sidewalk path, and as soon as I turn right on the same path, it's them. It happened quickly, but all I saw was a tall dark figure in dark clothing, still no face or features, and I start running. I knew then for sure without a doubt that I was being followed. I quickly look behind me, and I see them running as well. Thankfully, I was able to see the laundry room that my mom was at, and I started screaming for her. She walked right out, and right before I got to her, the dark figure was only about 5 feet behind me. He then shoulder checked me, which knocked me to the ground, and he then ran right past me, then disappearing into the darkness. I told my mom everything that happened, and we called my brother to come stay with us. My mom finished her laundry, and we walked back to her apartment, which was nearby. Then we walked back home together. This was one of the most terrifying nights of my life. I really can't imagine what could have happened to me if I wasn't so aware of my surroundings, or if I wasn't so paranoid of this man, but I'm really glad I was. I didn't have a good feeling about them from the start. Also, this was a very large, nice gated apartment complex in Orange County, California, which was usually very safe. I lived there twice in my life over a span of about 5 or 6 years, and I never once heard of anyone ever being attacked, followed, or kidnapped there. But I'm really glad I'm okay. This is about the time that I was almost kidnapped as a young child. It's something that not many people in my life know about, but I would really like to get it off my chest. This happened when I was in the 3rd grade, so I was 8 years old at the time. Back when I was in elementary school, I often rode the bus home, but occasionally, I would be allowed to walk to the local high school with my best friend at the time. This is because her mom was a teacher there. We'll call her A to respect her privacy. However, this one afternoon, I was supposed to be picked up by my mom, but had forgotten, and I thought it was a day when I could walk to the high school instead. And that's what I did. About a mile away from the high school, we had passed this one corner that had a bunch of apartments all clustered together, and as we were rounding it to cross the street, 2 older guys came out of seemingly nowhere and grabbed each of us. They grabbed us from around the middle in a tight hold. Whenever I remember that moment of what I was feeling, it was adrenaline and fear. Because I knew from safety school videos that you should never let yourself be taken to a secondary location. Unfortunately for us, screaming for help wouldn't have worked, because both perps put their hands around our mouths and the street was deserted. But as I looked at my friend, whose face was also frightened and terrified, something in me just clicked. I don't remember much, but I remember having just watched Miss Congeniality the night before, and I recall the scene when Sandra Bullock performed the sing on stage. A defensive strategy. And so, after biting my captor's hand, I shoved him really hard with my bag in the stomach, stomped on his foot, before then hitting him in the crotch with my elbow, before running toward my friend, who was a couple of feet away in front of me. The reason why I was able to grab a hold of her looking back was because her captor was distracted by the pain that I had just put mine through. So when I pulled her hand hard, he let go. Once she was free from her captor, the 2 of us ran as fast as our little legs could go. We went towards the high school, and when we were finally sure that we weren't still being followed, we stopped to catch our breaths. Later on, after getting to the high school, we told A's mom about what had occurred, because once the adrenaline wore off, I was really frightened that I had almost been taken. The cops would have been called, but neither of us remembered much of what the perps looked like due to everything that happened all at once. However, I do remember that A was taken out of public school the very next week, and well, our friendship faded in time because of that. I still often think about that incident, and I wonder what would have happened to A if I hadn't have been there in that afternoon. So yeah, to those guys who almost kidnapped us, I really hope you never tried that with any other children. You sick psychopaths. This story happened 12 years ago when I was 19. Before I start, it's really important to know that I was a short, petite, blonde female. I was 5'1", and I weighed around 108 pounds. I always appeared younger than I am, and back then I looked around 15 at the most. Anyway, my boyfriend and I had just booked our first ever cruise trip, which covered mainly European countries, but also Tunisia. On a cruise, the boat stops off at each country, and all passengers have the opportunity to leave the boat for a set amount of time and explore the area. We took full advantage and got off at every stop, really enjoying the culture and lapping up the sun. Something strange happened before we were scheduled to get off the ship in Tunisia. All of the passengers wanting to leave the ship had gathered in the area designated to meet, and the coordinator was instructing everyone on timings to be back for, as well as any other information we needed to know. After this, a staff member, no one of great importance, then appeared. He pulled my boyfriend over in private, and he then told him not to take me off the ship today. He didn't really give much of an explanation, just repeating a few times that it was really dangerous and I should stay on the ship for the whole day. We didn't really think too much of it, as he wasn't even a manager or a coordinator, although we did find it strange, as no one else was told not to leave or don't go to Tunisia. I'm quite a nervous person, so I agreed with my boyfriend to stay on board, and we enjoyed a day of sunbathing on an empty deck. We really enjoyed the rest of our cruise holiday, and we quickly forgot all about the strange encounter. That is until years later, when we were watching a documentary about crimes and trafficking on cruise trips. Now, in the documentary, we had learned about how trafficking gangs would have members actually working inside the cruise ships, and how they would alert the members on the ground about potential victims. Looking back, I was the perfect victim. I appeared to be a small teenage girl with my partner who was not very threatening looking at all. He was average height with a small build and could easily be overpowered. If we had left the ship, it would have been very easy to get rid of my boyfriend and kidnap me. The random employee who had pulled over my boyfriend must have known that there were plans to kidnap me, because no one else was pulled over and no one else was told not to leave. Just me. This then brought our attention to something else that happened on the cruise that further gave us the impression that this really was an attempted kidnapping. One of the first nights, it was a formal night. Everyone would dress up and have a fancy dinner, and there was also a photographer set up so that you and your party could have professional photos taken on the night and then purchase them once they were developed on the last night. My boyfriend and I jumped at the chance to have these photos taken for our memory book, and we really couldn't wait to see the final result. Now, on the last night in the designated area, everyone's photos were displayed along the walls with reference numbers so you can place your order. It was a large ship, and there were many photos to go through to find your own. My boyfriend and I searched and searched, but our photos were nowhere to be found. We even enlisted the help of the staff to find them, but they weren't even coming up on the system. It's like they had vanished and it never even happened. We have since theorized that this is because maybe the inside men on the ship wanted to erase evidence that I had been there, so that if I was taken, they could then argue I was never there. Maybe we really were overthinking it, or maybe we were exactly right. Anyway, I'm not really sure why that employee decided to give my boyfriend that heads up and then prevented us from leaving the ship, but I'm eternally grateful that he did. At the time of this story, I was 19, and I'm a gay male for context. The job I currently work at still had me go to Mexico for training because I'm one of the top workers. It was all paid for, so I said I would go. It was a group of 6 of us, 2 guys and 4 girls. Well, about 2 days in, 3 of our workers didn't want to stay extended, so they left, leaving me and the 2 other girls there in Mexico to help train some more. After training, we would go back to our hotel and usually just sit at the bar for a little bit. While we were at the bar, a guy comes up to us. He sits down across from us, and he then starts chatting with us. We'll call him Rick. Rick then starts telling us that he's in Mexico for work for a couple of days, and that he's from California. We say that we're also here for work, and that we're from Colorado. Then my coworkers leave to go to the store, and that they'll be back soon. After they leave, me and Rick are still just talking about nonsense. And at this point, I was thinking that he was flirting with me, but he was trying not to make it obvious. He said he's going to his room, and he asked for my Snapchat. I'm a little bit drunk after a few drinks, and I give it to him. I go back to my room, and this is about 30 minutes later, and he then texts me. He asked me if I wanted to hang out, and I said sure. Rick then asks if he can come to my room. I thought that this was my chance to get lucky, so I give him my room number. Well, a few minutes later, he comes to my room, and I let him inside. I had a little bit of wine before he texted me, so I'm pretty drunk at this point. He starts chatting, and he asks if we can watch some TV. We turn on some Netflix. He turns and looks at me, and he asks me if I'm drunk. I then nodded him that I am. He then starts kissing me, and I kiss him back. He stops to ask me if my coworkers wanted to hang out too. I said that I don't know, and he then said we should go to their rooms. I got a little suspicious when he said that, and I then told him that I don't even know their rooms, even though I did. He tells me he'll be back a little later because he's going to get some food. He leaves, and then 5 minutes later he texts me if I know where to get tacos, and if I can go walk with him. I say yes because right across from the hotel there's this really good taco place next to a really crowded club. So we're walking to the taco place, and I'm kinda just holding on to him because I'm still drunk. Well, the place ends up being closed, and right at that moment, this sketchy looking van pulls up. He opens the back door, and he tells me to get in. I ask him why, and he then said that it's VIP for the hotel. I asked why do I need it if the hotel is right across the street. That's when he then says it'll take me around the city and then back to the hotel. My stomach is then telling me to go back to the hotel right now. I also want to mention that at this point, I'm starting to sober up. When I decline to get into the van, he grabs my arm and then slowly pulls me to the van. And now I can kind of see inside, and there's a guy in the back seat, and he's sitting in the dark. I pull away, and I say that I'm good, and I then rush back to the hotel. I text my coworkers everything that just happened, and I then went to one of their rooms, then breaking down in tears. I was fully sober by now, and I was so scared at what happened. About an hour later, I went back to my room, and 10 minutes later there was knocking. I very slowly walked to the people without making a sound, and I saw the same man knocking. After I didn't answer, he started pounding on the door. Someone else ended up coming out of the room because of the loud pounding, and the man then ran off after that. I never saw the man again after that. I was so terrified, and I felt so stupid for trusting a random person. Please be careful, and always be aware, especially in other countries you're not familiar with. Something very badly could have happened to me, and I'm so glad that it didn't. I would like to keep my name anonymous, due to a couple of my friends who listen, and I haven't told them this story. The story is also a reminder to always trust your gut and have better judgment. This happened to me in December of 2019. I went to my local small town Walmart to get a few things that I needed for a project that I was working on for my job. It was 8 o'clock at night, so it wasn't super late. When I go to Walmart or any other store for that matter, especially at night, I always try my best to park close to the entrance and underneath a lit up light post. I went inside the Walmart, got the things I needed, and went back to my car. Now, this was probably my first mistake. I checked for my phone, and I sat in my car for a minute before driving off. A few moments passed, and I heard a knock on my window. I looked up, and I saw it was an older woman standing outside my car. Something to know about me, as I always try and give people the benefit of the doubt. What if she needs help? I questioned my head. I cracked my window only enough to hear what she would say, and not get her hand through the window. This is how the conversation then went. "Hi there, young lady. I noticed you walking through the parking lot, and you looked like a nice girl. Would you like to buy some tomatoes? I have some in the very back of my van," she said. This is when the red flags started going off in my head. Number 1, it's December in the Midwest. There's no homegrown tomatoes during this time of the year. Number 2, why is she trying to sell these so-called tomatoes at 8:30 at night in a Walmart parking lot? "No thank you," I replied, hoping she would just go on about her business, and so could I. "Sweetie, they're homegrown, and they're the best tomatoes you'll ever have," she said back to me. Now, at this point, I was getting a bit frustrated because I just wanted to get going, and I didn't like the vibes this woman was giving me. I grabbed my keychain out of my jacket in the slowest motion, and I gripped my pepper spray. I made sure the woman couldn't see what I was holding, but I was ready to use it just in case. "Look, I'm sorry, but I don't want any tomatoes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I really have to get going. I have someone waiting on me to pick them up," I replied with a more stern tone. The part of me picking someone up waiting on me was a total lie, but I figured if I said someone was expecting me, she wouldn't try anything stupid. She didn't say anything back. She just huffed and then started walking towards her stereotypical white creepy van. Now, this is important to note that our local Walmart has 2 parking lot entrances as well as exits, but one of them had to be closed off due to construction work. This forced me to have to drive past the van in order to leave the parking lot. I usually drive slowly through the parking lots because the people around here will walk out in front of you even if the car is moving. Out of pure curiosity, I glanced over to the van that the lady got inside of. This is when my heart then sank. I could then see the figures of 3 big men in the van. There were 2 in the back seat and 1 in the passenger seat. I stepped on the gas, running stop signs to get as far away from there as fast as I could. Looking back on it, I really wish I would have snapped a picture of the van to then report it to the police, but my body at the time was in fight or flight mode, and it chose flight. While on the way home, I took a longer way which consists of a lot of turns and different side roads, just to avoid them from possibly following me. Luckily, they didn't. I will forever be grateful that I listened to my gut in this situation. I really want to spread awareness with this story. You really can't trust anyone. Growing up, girls were always told to avoid strange men and that men are sex traffickers. Well, let me just tell you, women can be just as dangerous as men. And in a weird way to explain it, I feel that women are scarier because you would always assume you could trust another woman. Every time I look at tomatoes, I always think of what could have happened to me. Please be safe out there, everyone. My name's Dominique, and this happened around 2 years ago, but it still sickens me whenever I think about it. I'm from California, and I was hanging out with my best friend who we'll refer to as Fernie. We wanted to go to the mall during the summer, since we had just gotten out of school, and we wanted to go out and spend some time with each other. At the time, we didn't have a car to travel with, so we would always go on the bus. We went to the mall around 3 in the afternoon, and we practically spent the whole day there. When it eventually came nighttime, it was around 8:30 p.m., and the mall would be closing soon since it was a weekday. Pretty much we were the only people there, since nobody really goes to the mall on the weekdays. My phone had just died, and I remember at the front of the mall there were some seats where you can plug your phone in for it to charge. Me and Fernie didn't have enough money to go on the bus, so I had no choice but to call my parents to come pick us up. While I was trying to get my phone to turn on, me and Fernie were sitting across from each other. I wasn't really paying attention to my surroundings because I was just really frustrated because I was trying to find a way home. I decided to look up for a bit, and I noticed 2 older guys approaching me and Fernie. I assumed that they were homeless based on the way they were dressed, and I assumed one of them wanted to take a seat. So I stood up and I gave my seat to one of the guys. As he sat down, I continued to keep trying to find a way home because my parents weren't picking up. And suddenly, I then feel Fernie standing next to me. She starts to nudge me softly to try and get my attention, but I was so irritated to even care to ask why she's nudging me because of how stressed out I was to look for a ride. All of a sudden, I feel her then grab me. She then pulls and then starts running with me, and she then starts yelling at me to not stop running. At the entrance of the mall, there was a sketchy gray beat-up car right in front of the entrance, and we ran around it. As you can imagine, at this point I was really confused because I still didn't know why we were running. Well, I decided to look behind my shoulder, and I saw the 2 previous guys chasing us, trying to catch up. They ended up getting inside the gray car that was parked right in the entrance. Me and Fernie just kept running until we then saw a bus stop with a family there waiting for the bus. We decided to try and blend in with them. We had asked the lady for money who was trying to get on the bus, and the lady actually helped us. But so far, so many things were happening, and I still didn't really know why we were running. So once we got into the bus, I decided to ask Fernie, "Why the fuck did you do that? Why did you start running?" As she was trying to catch her breath, she then said something that will forever remain in my head. She said that when I gave up my seat, the 2 guys wouldn't stop staring, and Fernie wasn't trying to make it obvious that she was looking at them. She then said that the guy that was sitting down was looking at the other guy across from us, and he had put up 2 fingers, pointing at us, as if he was suggesting that we were all alone, and it was the only 2 of us here by ourselves. That's when they slowly started to get close to us to try and grab us. When she told me this, I started to burst into tears, because if it wasn't for her, I really don't know what would have happened to us if she didn't decide to grab me and make a run for it. So about 2 weeks after the incident, we were scrolling around on Instagram. We came across a page of the local news where they had put out news from our city, and it was on one of the recent posts. They had talked about how 2 men got arrested at the mall that we were just almost kidnapped at, and it was for trying to kidnap young girls. So far, there's still one girl missing out of all the girls that they kidnapped. We're very lucky that they didn't succeed in kidnapping us, and thank God they got caught. The story is about me and 3 other friends on Halloween of 2022. We were all 15 except for one of us who was 16. I decided to ask them if they wanted to go to a park near my house. I figured that a break from scaring children would do us some good. I was wearing a dragon onesie with a dragon skull mask, and another friend who I'll call A was wearing a mouse onesie. My friend who is 16, who I'll call friend B, also brought her other friend, who we'll call friend C. I decided, like I said, to go to the park. Everyone agreed, and our parents said yes, so we went to walk over to the park. Friend B and C were dressed up in revealing cowgirl costumes, so I was a little bit more weary because of that. We were walking down the street, and we were a few yards from the park, when I noticed a black SUV driving in front of us going extremely slow. Here's a layout of the street we were on. The street is downhill, and it has houses on both sides. When you get to the bottom where the park is, it makes a sharp left turn. The last house on the right has an alley between the park and said house to go to another street. Now back to the story. I noticed the car in front of us going super slow and then stopping where the walkway into the park was. I thought it was strange, but I kept walking. When the car came to a stop, a middle-aged man then stepped out and leaned against the side of the car closest to where we would be walking. As soon as I saw that, I tuned out of the conversation my friends were having with one another to be able to keep my focus on the man. We were about 3 yards away, if not more, when my horror story senses then kicked in. My hair stood up on end, and my senses were on full force. I assessed my surroundings, and I saw the alley to the other street. I told them as subtly as possible to go to the alleyway, so they did. I turned around as we went into the alleyway, and then saw the man look at us and then get back into his car. I told them to start running. They asked why, but I was already sprinting towards my house at this point. When we finally got there, they asked what happened, and I then told them. They said that I was overreacting, but friend C said she agreed with what I did. I'd learned to trust my scary story senses after hearing all these stories. I have some other stories like this that I may or may not submit. In the end, always trust your instincts, even if nothing does seem wrong. They just might save your life. To start off, I'm a 26-year-old female. The story happened to me almost 15 years ago, but it will forever haunt me. Back then, social media was just beginning. Even though my parents were against it, I had secretly made a MySpace account and became obsessed, as most teenagers are with social media nowadays. However, there was still no such thing as catfish, so children weren't aware of the dangers of social media. With that being said, I had over 1,000 friends, some of which I didn't know. Keep this part in mind as the story continues. Being the baby in the family, I never got dibs on using the computer at home, so I would walk to the local library just about every day to log onto MySpace. The library was about a 4-minute walk from my house, and I always felt safe, even without having a cell phone with me. On this particular day, I'd followed the same routine and walked to the library after school. That day, for some reason, my mom had given me her flip phone to call for a ride home if I didn't feel like walking once it got dark. I arrived at the library, and I sat behind the computer and began scrolling away. I noticed a familiar face, another girl who lived in the neighborhood, and she came down and sat next to me. Because we were supposed to be quiet while in the library, we chatted through the messenger on MySpace instead. We sat together for about an hour when she had sent me a chat and said, "Do you see that man over there?" As I looked up, I noticed a man who was in his 40s to 50s, and he was peeking through the bookshelves at us. He had on a baseball cap, so I was unable to get a great look at his face, but I could clearly see his dark eyes staring straight at me. I chatted her back, and I told her I had noticed, and I was creeped out. As time passed though, the man would take breaks by walking to a different book aisle, but he would always end up back behind the bookshelf staring at me. I felt myself becoming more and more creeped out, but like a silly teenager, MySpace seemed more important at the time than getting out of this crazy situation. My friend who was sitting next to me chatted me one last time, telling me she had to go home now. A pit in my stomach formed as I watched her log off her account and grab her bag to leave. As she then walked away, I noticed the man coming closer to me. With almost no hesitation, he sat right next to me and began using the computer. I now felt an overwhelming feeling of danger, but I tried to stare directly at my screen so he wouldn't notice how scared I was. After a few moments, I glanced at his computer screen, and what I saw made all the hairs on my neck stand up. My own private MySpace pictures. Yes, private. I knew that in order to view those pictures, you had to be my friend on MySpace. However, I didn't even know this man. My mind began to race, as I couldn't figure out how this was possibly happening. I had enough. I took out my mom's cell phone and began dialing. As I then said, "Mom, I really need a ride right now." The man became aware that I had saw his screen, and he then shut off his computer, put his head in his hands as if he was embarrassed and he was hiding his face. I got up and hid in another corner of the library until my mother arrived. When she came up the stairs, I was hysterical, and I tried my best to explain the situation to her. She walked over and took a good look at the man, almost to let him know that he had not gotten away with this one. When I later got home, we informed my dad, and he went back to the library to watch the man, as we were really concerned that he was stalking me. My dad discreetly followed him home so we had his address if anything else happened. To this day, I'm convinced that he was indeed a catfish who I had naively accepted, and that he must have been following me and knew my routine. I'm beyond thankful that I had my mom's cell phone, and that I was smart enough not to walk home alone. If I had, I really don't think I'd be here today. Do not accept people you don't know as followers. The extra follower really isn't worth it. I was 15 years old at the time. I had two friends named Chris and Nicole. On one cold February night, a Saturday, we were really bored out of our minds at Chris's house, so we wanted to do something fun. Chris had told us that he had black and red spray paint in his closet. Now, I live in a relatively busy suburban city, and his house was in the not-so-nice part of town. So there's this big hill that his house sits upon, and down the hill are train tracks. The train tracks are where the kids go to smoke, drink, and graffiti things. I had sandals on, and there was no way I was going to walk through the dirt and wet grass to get down there in open-toed shoes. So Chris gave me a pair of Converse that were 2 sizes too big, but of course I wasn't complaining. It's better than nothing, right? So we stepped out of the window trying to make as little noise as possible because Chris's mom was asleep, and the front door was also really loud. It was around 10 p.m. at this point. We hopped down from the balcony onto his backyard patio. The jump down honestly wasn't too bad. Out of all the friends I hang out with, I get really bad anxiety. I wasn't usually into this type of stuff, but I could tell Chris and Nicole really wanted to go use the spray paint on the cement wall that were next to the train tracks. So I guess I just went along with it because I didn't want to be a burden on their fun. Looking back though, I really wish I would have just stayed home. So we get off this patio and we start the walk down the muddy hill to the rocks and train tracks. In the dark, it was insanely intimidating. We had no source of light at all. Their phones were dead, and mine was just about to die. I was saving the battery for some pictures of the graffiti that we had sprayed to show our other friend Sam, who had different plans that night. It was also a new moon, so there was no light coming from the sky. We finally got down to the tracks and rocks. Even though it was only about a 5-minute max walk, it felt like forever. Walking on the rocks at night in shoes that were way too big for me was really difficult. We also had this English teacher that we all hated. His name was Mr. Kuntz. The other kids in our class always called him Mr. Kuntz, because that's how his name was actually spelled. So we had sprayed his name in red and a bunch of 6s in a row. Looking back, this part still legitimately gives me nightmares, I swear. Once we were about to turn and walk across the rocks and up the hill to Chris's house, all of a sudden, a super bright light shined in our faces. I can't even explain the fear and confusion that I actually felt in that moment. I was way too afraid to turn and look at my friends to see the looks on their faces. I was standing in between the two of them. Shit, I thought. Was it a cop? No, that's stupid. I mean, if it was a cop, he would have made his presence known. I was trying to calm myself down. Since the flashlight was so bright and the sky was so dark, we couldn't see anything behind it, let alone who was even shining it. To my horror, the flashlight that was aimed at us turned around quickly with force, then revealing the face of a grown man. He was probably around 30 years old, 6 feet tall, and he was wearing a hood over his head. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to explode right out of my chest. Here we are, 3 innocent freshmen face to face with a grown man who clearly had bad intentions with us. I hadn't glanced at my friends yet to see their reactions, but I'm quite sure they were just as afraid as I was. I had no clue where this was about to go or what was about to happen. We were all small 15-year-old kids, so obviously this man could do whatever he wanted to us. The only weapon we had on us was one of the spray paint bottles that Chris was holding at the time. I was just praying he was on the same page as me. Spray paint the man's face if he lunges at us. The man finally broke the silence, then sang in a low, raspy voice.
Hey, are you kids doing drugs down here?
I was frozen still, so I finally looked to my right and then locked eyes with Nicole. I looked back at the man and I nervously shook my head no. He chuckled a bit, then sang,
Oh, well, do you kids want some drugs?
Yeah, hell no. This man was definitely dangerous. I had no idea when it was time to make a run for Chris's house, but this man was standing right in front of us, meaning that he was blocking the way that we would need to walk back to get to the house. Not a single one of us answered the man. I haven't been so scared in my whole life. So many different questions were going through my head. Does he have a weapon? A knife? A gun? All of us were so helpless. There also weren't many houses around, so who the hell knows if our screams could even be heard if we were to do so. The man started to slowly inch his way toward us, stopping when he was about a car's length away from us. I had no fucking idea how this situation was going to end, but I was pretty damn sure I was about to die. There was absolutely nothing stopping this man from kidnapping and murdering us. He took one more step towards us, slowly moving his hand to his back pocket. I didn't give a fuck anymore, and that was enough for me to break down screaming, "Run! Let's get the fuck out of here!" Chris ran left around the man, and Nicole and I ran around on his right side. I was stumbling all over the place, running on the small rocks spread all over the ground surrounding the tracks. I thought that the sound of all of our shoes hitting the rocks would conceal the sound of the man following us, so I had no idea if we were being chased or not. We were all in pretty good shape, so we ran fast. To my horror, I shot a single glance from behind me, only to see the man charging for us as we ran, with his flashlight shining in my damn eyes, only becoming closer. I didn't care how much noise I made. The 3 of us did our best to stay running next to each other, just to make sure one of us didn't get left behind. We had to think fast. Once we got far enough down the train tracks to see the hill leading up to Chris's house, I could just sense the man gaining on us. I was fearing for the worst that at any second, He could just grab one of us and we'd be done for. We came to the bottom of the hill leading up to his house and sprinted up on it, not looking back. Normally I would be falling all over the place with how muddy it was, but my adrenaline wouldn't let me fall. We realized that we had forgot to leave the front door unlocked for us to come back inside. So we had to knock on the door until his mom opened up. She was absolutely shocked to see us so out of breath. But earlier she had insisted we weren't supposed to leave the house, so she wasn't too happy. At that point though, we just didn't give a fuck about anything. She asked what the hell we were up to, why we were outside at night, why we were so out of breath, and why the hell were we holding spray paint cans. We didn't know what to say. We couldn't play it off as going to the store to grab snacks, since there's no snack shop around his house. So yeah, we came clean. We told her how we were graffitiing because we were bored. She just told us that we were dumb and to not do it again. She also confiscated all the spray paint cans and told us to go to bed. We were exhausted. The next morning when we woke up, we all just discussed everything that happened. Every time I think of this night, I always cringe so hard. My life and their lives could have easily ended that night. This night took me weeks to get over, and it's been 2 years ever since. Now it's just an interesting story to tell my friends. My mother was stationed at Kadena Air Force Base around the late 2010s, and being a military child at the age of 12, my life had reset once again. I didn't have friends again, and I had to learn an entire new neighborhood. I didn't really have anything that made me ecstatic. That is, except for the Pokemon League held on base. It was ran by a few people who had earned their judge cards from Nintendo, and they held tournaments and just open game nights. It was really fun picking up the card game, playing in the video game. They even had a small gym and Elite Four system. I made a lot of friends, and one of them who was the judges, who I am thankful to still to this day, because if it wasn't for him, I might not be here right now. The judge in question will refer to as Professor Getsu for the sake of anonymity, and he was a really nice guy. He was the youngest of the three, and he wore a white professor's getup. He looked maybe on the edge of his teens, early 20s with dark hair and glasses, and he had a skinny frame. He was extremely helpful to newcomers, sort of like the big brother we could all look up to, and also strive to beat in our children's cars and video games, even though his game name of Getsu was a bit nerdy, even for me. He was always one of the last people to leave, helping to clean up, and he supposedly lived nearby. The last thing is important for what's about to happen. It was a bit of a colder night when the event ended. I was sitting outside in the parking lot scrolling through memes that my friend had texted me, all while I was waiting for my parents to arrive to pick me up. I was just kinda zoning out as the time had clicked by when I heard someone nearby.
Hey girly, you play Pokemon?
I looked up at some really big dude, kinda chubby looking. I saw him every now and then in the events, and he didn't really stand out that much. I gave a small nod, then saying, "Yeah, I do," as he then gives this wide smile, like creepy wide. He starts walking forward, and I'm then hit with this nasty stench, like really bad body odor. I blinked as I bid, as I then see he's walking from a black sedan, and its back door is wide open.
I got this really cool card collection. Come here, let me show you.
Now, my parents have always taught me about stranger danger, but my kid brain thought, hey, he went to the events and I saw him there, so this should be fine. At least so I thought. That is until he grabbed me by my wrist and started to actually drag me to the sedan. To say that I immediately started screaming is an understatement. Stinky didn't care though. He was still dragging me, saying,
"Shut up, you're gonna have fun,"
and throwing out things about trading cards, like someone listening would think that he was dealing with a whiny kid. I honestly thought that I was going to be taken, and that I would never see my mom and dad ever again, that I would end up on the back of a milk carton and never be seen again. Silly, I know, but I was rather sheltered about dying and death at that time. Thankfully for me, however, Professor Getsu had walked out at that very moment, presumably on his way to walk home. All I know is I then heard the sound of fabric hitting the dude's face as Professor had swung his professor coat right into the dude's face. I feel his hand go to where the dude's grabbing my arm, and I then see his hand grab Stinky's pinky finger and then yank back, and hard. Stinky let go and yowled like an animal as the professor pushed me back behind him as he then yanked the coat off the guy. He then kicked at the back of the dude's knees as he caused him to buckle as the professor grabbed his wrist and pulled back on them. Stinky groaned in even more pain than before as the professor looked at him with just a cold look in his eyes. The big brother figure was gone and something else was in its place, and I think I was a bit scared of it. The professor's tone of voice when he spoke didn't help either. It was like icy daggers lingered with his words against Stinky. If I see you back here or doing this shit to my charges, this will pale in comparison to what the Japanese prisons will do to you. Stinky would scramble away and then get into his car, peeling away out of the parking lot. The professor still glaring at him until he was out of sight. He would then guide me inside the venue, buy me some fish and chips, and sit down with me until my parents arrived. The cold persona he had when he kicked that dude was gone. He was right back to being the big brother that I knew. To be frank, that really frightened me. I didn't quite understand why the teenager was so aggro. I only later learned that Professor Getsu was also a black belt who had apparently taught kids how to defend themselves with his mother at the local activity center. I suspected that he had something of a protective persona or something in his own life that had led him to act in such a way. He explained the situation to my folks when they arrived. I wasn't allowed to go to the events and league as much as I was used to, but I still did from time to time. Professor Getsu was still his normal self at the events and always helping people, but he would stop coming to the events a year afterwards, his license having expired and his father moving out of the country soon. Reaching about the same age as he was, and with a little sibling on my own, I really sympathized with how for a brief moment, he became something terrifying just to make sure I was safe. Oh, and as for Stinky, he never showed up to the events again. He was either banned, or he was just really scared of Professor Getsu. I really wish the professor a good life, and I hope he's doing well to this day. As for Stinky, I really hope we never see each other again. So first off, this is my first story of many to share. This was about 20 years ago, and I had just graduated high school. I was pretty young and wild and unaware of a lot of the world's dangers. Plus, I grew up in a small quiet town in Arkansas, where pretty much everyone knew everyone. I was 19 years old, and at the time, AOL was the big thing. I had been chatting with a guy from New York City for like 6 to 7 months on the phone and webcam, so I myself thought that I really knew him. He had offered to buy me a one-way plane ticket to New York City in order to see me. That should have been the first red flag. Why a one-way ticket? Anyways though, he had bought both me and my friend, who we'll refer to as K, plane tickets. My parents kept telling me not to do it, that it's a very bad idea. But being young and dumb and a bit rebellious, I went anyways. We eventually landed, and he picked us up from the airport. On that night, we'd stayed at a house outside of New York City, and he said that the next day we'll go to the city. So we rested, and the next day we got into a strange car, and we then headed to NYC. I was honestly completely blown away and amazed. He then told me and Kay to go grab our stuff, and I'll park the car and be right back. So we then waited at the central train station for what felt like forever. So I had called his cell phone over and over, and then something absolutely insane happened. A police officer had answered his phone and said they had been arrested, and that the car that we were in was actually stolen. And not only that, but he apparently also had a very high reputation for sex trafficking young women. Then it all hit me. He was probably intending to sell me and Kay, and we would have never been seen again by our families and friends. I started crying, not knowing anything about NYC with absolutely no money in my pocket, and not really sure what the hell we were supposed to do next. It was a long day, and I called my parents. They had wired me some money through Western Union, which I had to locate, and they also got us a hotel and a plane ticket back home the next morning, so we had to get on a subway and find the hotel in Long Island. I want to thank the man upstairs for watching over us. I still can't believe my friend and I were almost taken away from our families, never to be seen or heard from again. It's extremely terrifying to think about that. Please stay safe, my friends. In 2013, I was a 9-year-old female. I'm now 19. I had moved to Germany for my mom's job. I lived in an apartment right across from a park. Now, this specific park was one like no other. It was different and unique. I'm from Ohio, so it was pretty interesting to me. My sister, who was 12, then decided to play at the park and thought it would be a good idea. My dad was the only parent home then, so we told him we would play at the park across the street. We then crossed the street and made our way to the park. As we were walking, I noticed a strange man on the opposite side of the street. I glanced at him, and I saw that he was already looking at my sister and I. This man, who we'll call John, looked homeless. He had a long gray beard, and he was on the heavier side. And overall, he just looked like he needed a shower. I noticed that he crossed the street, and then walked behind my sister and I. At that point, I had had a gut feeling that something was off. My sister and I had just entered the park at this point, and John had followed us all the way to the park, and had just stopped at the entrance and exit, blocking us from leaving the park. He was standing there and staring at us with a blank stare, looking like he had no life in his eyes. The park was on a hill, so my sister and I decided to run down it to get to the other side so he couldn't see us. We then noticed that he left, and then we decided to keep playing on the swing set. I really wish I could say that this was the end of the story, but the truth is way more disturbing. We then noticed that John was back, and he wasn't alone. He had brought another guy with him. Again, they just stood at the entrance and exit, blocking us from ever leaving. Right at that point, I ran to the other side of the park, my sister following me, and I was bawling my eyes out because I was terrified. My sister then decided it would probably be a good idea to leave through the original exit, and I refused and continued crying. Just for some context, this all happened in broad daylight. I then decided that I would hop the fence and go back home because I absolutely refused to go out of the way those guys were at. I was crying so loud that my dad had heard me from the apartment, and he then screamed out of the window to get home. I saw that the guys had ran away after they heard my dad yell for my sister and I. My dad had also seen these men run away as soon as he yelled for us. At that point, we both hopped on the fence and ran all the way back to the apartment. I was still crying because I was so scared and also thinking of what could have happened to us. Even though I was young, I still knew the importance of stranger danger because of all the datelines my mom watched and her telling me about it. Again, my sister and I were the only people at this park. I still can't wrap my head around why John followed us all the way to the park, then stood there, watched us, and then brought one of his friends to do the same. But I really hope I never find out. So I'm a 40-year-old female, and the story happened to me when I was 27 years old. At the time, I had a car, but it had been in the shop for like 3 weeks, so I had to walk everywhere. I grew up in a small town when I was younger, but we had moved to another town about 30 minutes away when I was about 10. We had visited the little town a lot because of my mom's side of the family was there. Well, when I was about 22 years old, I found out I was pregnant, and my baby's father and I had gotten married. He wanted to be close to his parents, who lived about an hour away, and mine were only about 15 minutes away. So we compromised, and we moved between the both of them, which put us back in the small town I grew up in. Now, a couple of years down the road, my then husband and I decided we were going to divorce. We had just bought a house, so money was pretty tight. So we were still in this house together, and we had a disagreement. I decided I needed to take a walk and go clear my mind. It was around 10 o'clock at night during the summer. I know, very stupid idea. It's also dark and humid. I was wearing a skirt, a plain top, no makeup, and my hair was in a ponytail. I figured that I wouldn't attract any attention. I was wrong. As I'm about to turn down this small side street, this truck was driving by me very slowly. I hear this truck down another street, or so I thought. Then these headlights start shining on my back. My mind starts to think of a million things at once, but I was really trying my best not to show any panic. So I pretended that I'm going to this house that was very close. As I start to approach the porch and take out some of the keys, the truck drives off. So I then think, great, the idiot left. And I start walking again, but not back to my house like a smart person should have. So I turn down another street, and the headlights show up again, and they're staying right behind me. I thought, okay, how am I going to get out of this? I then started praying so hard. I remember my husband telling me that there was a path between these houses that would lead me back to our street. We lived in a little dead-end street, and so if I took the path, I would come out near our street, and our house was 2 houses away from this path. I just needed this truck to be distracted so I could run to this path. Well, a car shows up behind this truck and honks its horn, and the truck takes off, and so do I. I then run to that path. I'm pretty sure the person in the car thought I was a nutcase running like wild. I get to our street and run to our house, and I see the truck pass by my street, and I then bang on the door, and my nephew opens it. I then burst inside and slam the door shut. I look out the window, and he goes by again, just looking at my house. My husband at the time wakes up, asking what the noise is all about. I then begin to tell him everything that's happened, and he goes and stands on the porch. The guy in the truck drives by one last time, and I call the cops. Of course, they don't do anything about it but take my statement, and also telling me not to be walking around at night because this town isn't safe. I don't go anywhere at night unless I need to now, and it's always in a car now. I think I was around 7 to 9 years old when this happened. My mom had taken me to a local park not far from where we lived, and it was somewhere we would go regularly, usually with my dad. But he wasn't with us that day. He was probably at work. The park was pretty open, so there were loads of different ways to get in and out. There was a large field to the left of the playground and the surrounding areas filled with plants and picnic areas, and walkways as well. It was always active with dog walkers, families, or kids playing on the equipment. One of the entrances to this park was a large gateway surrounded by big trees that formed a sort of archway. There was this really tall slide that was directly across from this archway. It was a fairly big park, so to walk from the archway entrance to the slide would have taken 1 to 2 minutes. It was a quiet day, and me and my mom were the only ones at the park. I vividly remember sitting right at the top of the big slide, getting ready to go down. I looked forward, and walking through the entrance directly across from me, I then saw the silhouette of this man walking through the trees into the playground. My heart sinks, and I immediately felt very bad vibes from this guy. I was already scared for some reason, and I didn't want to slide down and get any closer to this man. Something in my little mind told me to stay very clear of this guy. I went back down the steps of the slide and ran back toward the picnic bench and sat next to my mom. Now sure, I was an anxious kid, and I was practically mute with most people until my teen years. I just didn't like talking to most people, but I didn't have a problem playing when other people were around. It was a park after all, and I expected to see people around, but I had never had this type of feeling around any adult before. I just knew something was off. Even as a small child, I thought it was really weird that this grown-ass man was on his own, walking through the entrance of the park that takes you directly into the playground when he could have gone anywhere else. This place was massive after all, and I mean, he decided to walk straight towards a young woman and a small child. So I'm sitting next to my mom on the bench, and this guy actually comes and talks to us. I remember him saying something along the lines of,
"Oh, I hope I didn't scare you. I noticed that you didn't go down the slide. Don't let me stop you from playing."
And he then proceeds to ask a bunch of questions, like what happened to my arm. I was wearing a sweatband, and he had mistook it for a bandage. My mom was trying to be friendly, but also being short with him and answering all of his questions with just a few words. I knew she too wanted to get rid of him. I was screaming in my mind for him to just please go away. We didn't move from the bench, and after what felt like an hour, he eventually ended up leaving. The entire conversation was super uncomfortable. I can't really remember if we had left straight away after that, but I do remember that I didn't move from her side until he was completely out of sight. I mentioned this guy to my mom a year or so back, and she said that she too was also super uncomfortable around him, which I didn't know at the time. She was saying that she thought that he was trying to persuade me to leave her so that he could grab me when she wasn't looking, and honestly, I think I believed that too. She also mentioned feeling uneasy afterward, and how she thought that maybe there was a car out of sight waiting to grab me. My instincts have always been pretty spot on, and it's really odd that we both had the same gut feeling about him. Maybe me and my mom both just sound crazy paranoid, but I genuinely think that that guy was up to no good, and I'm glad I followed my instincts. It was during Christmas break of 2022 when I visited my family in the northern Mexican state of Nuevo León. Northern Mexico has on and off been in the news for a number of kidnapping, gang and drug and gun crimes, especially those that resulted in the deaths of American tourists. For some background knowledge, I was traveling alone as a 14-year-old male because my parents had split, and my mom had no interest in going to visit my Mexican father's side of the family. The deal was that I would take a direct flight from Boston to Monterrey, the capital of Nuevo León, where my Uncle Juan would pick me up before we would drive an hour or so west to a small town. I had only met my Uncle Juan once for my sister's quinceañera when I was around 8 years old, so I only had vague memories of him. When I had safely made it to the airport, he was eagerly waiting for me at the gate. He wasn't exactly the kind of guy I would want to drive me through northern Mexico alone at night, due to the fact that he was 5'3" and weighing somewhere in the 200s. I'm quite small myself at 5'5" and 120 pounds, so neither of us looked the most intimidating. The only safety confidence I had was from the martial art classes I took weekly back in the States. Anyway, when he helped me put my bags in the trunk of the car and we got in, we sped off from the airport. We eventually left the city and went off on dirt side roads that looked more like hiking trails. Uncle Juan was a man of few words, making the drive extremely awkward. I simply stared out of the passenger's window of Uncle Juan's beat-up van and all the pastures, especially the fruit plantations illuminated by the late-night moon. This is how it was for around 30 minutes of the drive, that is until Uncle Juan veered off from the road and then pulled into a sketchy-looking gas station. "Shit, we're nearly out of gas," he said angrily in Spanish. I didn't pay much attention to the area of the gas station, and I simply just listened to music on my phone until a large pickup truck pulled in aggressively next to us. Uncle Juan had gotten out of the van and had gone inside to pay for the gas, so there I was left all alone in the van. I took a closer look at the pickup truck, and I noticed that 6 heavy-set men were riding in the back, holding guns taller than them. They also wore black bandanas covering their face from the dust that rolled in from the desert. I began to panic as the driver got out and began to approach the driver's window of my uncle's van. his face covered by a bandana. "Where's your father at, Cambroncito?" he asked me in a very thick Spanish accent. I simply sat there wide-eyed, looking like a deer in the headlights. Not here," I replied in a scared tone. "You got any pesos? I can't afford the gas," he asked, suddenly pulling on the driver's side door, trying to open the van. That's when I lost my shit, and I had to come up with a plan to get myself out of the car before he tried to kidnap me. Several children in Mexico my age were kidnapped in a similar manner. Yes, let me go into the gas station to get my uncle," I finally replied. The man looked like he was about to say something more, but I just threw open the van door and made a run for it into the gas station. My uncle was chatting it up with the clerk. I quickly explained to them the issue, and the clerk grabbed his pistol from behind the counter, and we ran out into the parking lot. The truck was gone now, but the driver's side door was wide open. We found it odd that it appeared they didn't try and take anything when we got back in, but we obviously weren't complaining. "Are you ready to leave?" Uncle Juan asked me. "Yeah, let's get the fuck out of here," I replied in Spanish. He started up the van and proceeded to pull out of the parking lot. The van wouldn't budge. Uncle Juan looked extremely confused and pissed off. He jumped out of the van and ran around it in circles, checking all the tires, and then opening the hood to examine the damage. "They slashed our tires," he exclaimed. The clerk called us a tow truck, which took us in the van to my family's home, where I spent the rest of the vacation unharmed and without any other issue. I'm not really sure the true intentions of those men, or if they were cartel kidnappers, but I'm sure as hell happy that I listened to my own instincts to get out of that car before anything worse could happen. I don't plan on visiting northern Mexico for a long time. This story has surely taught me to always trust my instincts whenever I'm in a sketchy situation or a bad area. I'm a 15-year-old female. The story actually happened to my mother just a few days ago. To give you some background, my family and I live in a nice neighborhood. There's a few running paths around, as well as trails. My grandparents live in another neighborhood that connects to ours through a roundabout. This becomes important later. One afternoon, my grandmother invited me over to her house to help with some baking. Since my mother had said she was going to go running, I grabbed my dog, who's a pit bull mix. So understandably, we couldn't leave him alone, and I had her drop us off. A day later, my grandmother and I were talking. She asked me if my mother had told me what happened to her while she was running. I told her that she's never said anything to me. My grandmother explained while my mother was out running the other day, a truck had started to pull up behind her. She motioned for them to pass her, but they didn't, and then continued to drive slowly behind her. As she approached a roundabout, the truck drove down a dead-end street. Halfway through the street, the truck stopped and then parked, watching her run by. As you can tell by now, my mother was creeped the fuck out. After she passed the roundabout, she started jogging home. As she turned into our neighborhood, the truck sped off. The story may not be that scary, but for my family, it was incredibly scary, as my mother could have easily been kidnapped. I really hope that this never happens to anyone else. I just have one thing to say about what happened. To whoever followed my mother that day, stay the fuck away from her. And to everyone else, please be safe. I'm a 21-year-old female, and I'm currently attending college in South Carolina. Football is a huge part of student life at my school, so studying abroad during the fall was a big no-no. So I decided the perfect time to study abroad was the spring semester. I had studied in Florence, Italy from the beginning of February to the end of May of 2023. This story happened to me just a few months ago while I was traveling solo during one of my last weekends abroad. I didn't have the best relationship with my abroad roommates, but that's another story. So I decided I would try my hand at solo traveling. I knew solo traveling, especially as a young and objectively attractive female, could be dangerous. But having listened to so many of these stories, and generally having an awareness of my surroundings, I believed I would be smart and that nothing would happen to me. I had heard of a nice aquarium located in Genoa, Italy, so I decided that's where I would go solo. I honestly didn't do that much research into the city. I had been through briefly on a Flixbus from Nice, France back to Florence a few weeks prior, and I thought it looked really nice. We also had finals coming up, so the idea of a chill weekend going to an aquarium was very appealing. The train up from Florence had been super nice. We went through Cinque Terre, which are these beautiful coastal towns in the north of Italy. When I arrived in Genoa, I actually got off at the wrong station, and I had to walk an hour through the city with my heavy backpack to get to my hostel. For the sake of people keeping aware, and if y'all want to visualize the setting of my story, I had actually stayed at Ostello Bello Genova, which was a very nice hostel, and sadly where my story takes place. As I walked through the city, I realized that it wasn't as quaint as I had imagined, and was very much a commercial port city, with huge container ships for importing and exporting. Not all areas of the city felt sketchy though. It was Friday, and I had planned on going to the aquarium the next morning, so when I arrived at the hostel, I wasn't quite sure what to do with myself. There was a common area with a bar past the check, and desk downstairs. I had a paper due on Monday, so I decided that I would go work on it in the common area. Saying online that people sometimes find other solo travelers to hang out with in hostels, I was open to and hoping to meet some new people. When I got to the common area, I awkwardly stood by the bar trying to decide if I wanted to find an open table to find another solo person to sit with. As I was scanning the room, a man sitting at the table right in front of me then says to me, "Are you okay?" But said it in an accent I couldn't quite place. Having lived in Italy for a few months and traveled to 6+ countries since moving abroad, I had heard many accents, just not his. He was older than me, probably mid-30s, with a tight black t-shirt that showed his muscles and visible tattoos, and slicked back black hair. Definitely not unattractive. He was sitting with an older man who was probably in his mid-60s, who also didn't look bad for his age. The pair sat, taking up a 4-person table. I was kind of caught off guard because I wasn't sure how I must have looked for him to ask me that out of the blue. So I just said, yes, and then he said, "You can sit with us if you want," again with an accent. I don't really know what possessed me, but I said sure. I then sat down at their table next to the younger man, and I opened my laptop to begin working on my paper. I instantly regretted sitting with them, and I was honestly annoyed with myself for not just saying no thanks, with me sitting at the table with both men staring at me. The younger one began asking me questions like, "How old are you?" I didn't really see the harm in this question though, because I didn't see how that information could really matter. So I said I was 21, and the man then laughed and said, "Oh, I'm 18, which was obviously a lie, but I just replied back with, "Cool," which made him go even lower, then saying, "Actually, I'm 14, and then busted out laughing and then staring at the older man. I'm not really quite sure why he thought that was so funny. He then asked me if I spoke French, which I told him no, which then prompted him to start saying things to the older man, who at this point had only stared at me without saying anything in words that I couldn't understand. I tried to just stare at my computer, kicking myself that I'd been so stupid for allowing myself to interact with these men. I knew better than that, and the vibe I got from these men gave me the worst gut feeling. I just knew something was off about them. So as soon as I sat down with them, I had already begun to look for a way to escape my situation, but without it being awkward and uncomfortable. I really hate uncomfortable situations. I've always been someone who struggles to stand up for themselves in situations that might end awkwardly. I guess you could say I'm a people pleaser. So when that young man started to tell me about a cool party that they were having later at his friend's apartment, gesturing to the older man and that it was just 5 minutes away, I said, "Yeah, maybe. Sounds cool." But in my mind, I was screaming. I had heard these stories before, seen these in movies, and I knew what this was. Obviously, I wasn't going to actually go to this quote-unquote party, but for the sake of not making things uncomfortable until I can move away from them, I acted like I was open to the idea. Really, what I was thinking was, why the fuck would you be in a hostel if you had an apartment that you say is 5 minutes away? The younger man then proceeded to pull out his phone and then show me pictures to further entice me to go to this party. The photos looked like crappy Craigslist pictures. All the lights in this apartment he was showing me pictures of were red, and he pointed out a bong on a coffee table, then sang, "And we have weed as well," as if that would further convince me to go. I was still freaking out on the inside, keeping my composure and then acting concentrated on my paper that I'd pulled up on my computer. They then started to talk about food. After about a minute of what I assumed was back and forth, the young man turned to me again, and he told me they were leaving to go get food. He then asked me if they could get me anything. I just declined though, then sang, "Oh, I'm okay, thanks though." He was persistent, asking again, "Are you sure?" "Yeah, I already ate," I said. Then he repeated with a ton of questions, like, "Oh, you ate earlier? Are you full?" Yeah, I'm full," I told him. Finally, he accepted defeat, looking slightly disappointed, and he and the older man then stood up to leave. Before they walked away, the younger man then said, "We'll be right back. Hold our table. Don't go anywhere." The older man stood behind him, just staring at me. I couldn't read his expression, and he still never once said anything to me. I nodded my head, silently agreeing that I would still be here, and then they turned and walked towards the entrance. As soon as I was sure that they were gone, I grabbed my computer and got up. I was very thankful that they had left and that I was now finally free from that conversation, but my heart was still racing. I still had to work on my paper, and unless I was sitting on my hostel bed, which was a triple-decker bunk bed, and of course I had the top bunk, there was nowhere else I could sit and do my paper. Luckily for me, the common room with the bar had an adjoining room which had doors leading to more tables and where the breakfast was set up. Because of this, there were sections of wall in which you couldn't see into the other room. And with my computer, I went to this other room, and fortunately there was a table placed against this wall where I could sit without being seen from the common room. I sat here reflecting on the conversation. I couldn't believe I had gotten myself into that on the one weekend that I decided to travel alone, and I still had 2 nights left in the hostel. I sat at this table for probably about an hour, just staring at my blank paper, still shaken up. I decided to peek into the other room, and then thought, shit. Sitting back at the original table was the 2 men, back from wherever they had been. I had sat back forward hoping they hadn't seen me, and then praying they wouldn't confront me for moving tables if they had. Across the room in this adjoining room, which if any of y'all are reading or having trouble visualizing, just look up the hostel name and you'll see that they have pictures you can follow. But there was a girl probably about 3 or 4 years older than me sitting alone. So I decided to be bold. I got up and I walked over to her table, now aware that I could be seen from the common room. I set my laptop on the table and said, "Hey, would you mind watching this for me for a minute?" I left my laptop with her, and I then went to the bar and grabbed a free drink with the voucher the front desk had given me upon my arrival. I knew that they could see me, but I didn't glance in their direction. I went straight back to the girl, and instead of moving again, I sat down and opened my computer at her table. I actually did get to talking to her, and she was pretty cool. I can't remember her name, but she was a graduate student from Germany doing solo travel during her time off. I hung out with her a while. Honestly, I got nothing done with my paper, but I eventually decided that I needed to go to sleep so I could actually wake up early to go to the aquarium. A few times I had glanced into the other room, and the men had been talking to another girl alone, but as I walked through the common room to get to the elevators, which were by the front desk, she was no longer with them. I kept my head straight to not make eye contact. I could tell they were staring though. My body could feel it. The hairs on the back of my neck then stood up. I breathed a sigh of relief when I made it to the elevators. As I had stepped onto the elevator, the girl who had been the men's next victim walked into the elevator as well. I tried to make conversation with her, hoping that I could potentially warn her that those guys were the worst of news and that I've never had a worse gut feeling. But unfortunately, she didn't speak English, so I gave up. The next day, however, I didn't see the men in the morning, and I was able to have a lovely morning at the aquarium, but I still kept my eyes peeled and focused on my surroundings just in case. I decided to head back to the hostel around lunch just to grab a snack. They had free fruit in the adjoining breakfast room, and I wanted an apple. As I walked towards the hostel, I was then horrified to see that the men were back, and they were occupying a table located outside the front of the hostel. I decided this time I wouldn't entertain any conversation with them. I had to pass by to enter the hostel, and as I did, the younger man then called out, but I ignored it, then made a beeline straight to the back of the hostel to grab my apple. In the adjoining room, I stood leaning against the table with the fruit, while I quickly ate my apple and was hopeful that the way I was standing I wouldn't be able to be seen from the common room. I couldn't believe that they were back. It terrified me. Before I could even finish my apple, a figure walked into the adjoining room. It was the older man, the man who had not spoken one word to me. He then stopped in his tracks when he saw me, took me in for 1 second, and then turned and walked back into the common room. By the way he walked in, I could tell that he was indeed checking to see if I was still in there. My heart raced. I threw my apple away, and I braved myself to walk through the common room into the elevator shaft to go upstairs. As I walked back though, both men were now sitting at the bar, and they had made a glance towards me as I walked into the room. I kept my head high and straight, again ignoring them. As soon as I made it to the elevator, I texted my sister. I didn't want to text my mom because I didn't want to freak her out. I texted my sister the night before, then saying, "Look, I really fucked up. I accidentally talked to scary men. Don't worry, I left them because they left to get food, and they told me to stay, but I didn't. They were gonna get me food too, but I told them no. It's really giving me Taken vibes." But this time, I decided to text her again, then saying, "The scary men are back lurking around the hostel. I'm gonna be cautious. I don't think anything will happen, but just to have it on record, Ostello Bella Genova, Saturday." They were the guys sitting on security camera at the bar around 1 p.m. They then moved from outside. This is what they looked like. The younger man had black hair and possibly a black shirt. The older man had graying hair and a grayish shirt. I don't want to scare you by sending this, but it's just in case. The fact that I had seen them again and that I still had one more night in the hostel really scared me, but I had spent good money to be there. So after about an hour hiding out in my room, I decided to go back out to get lunch and go to Zara. I was cautious. I immediately looked towards the bar and out the front of the table situated in front of the hostel to see if they were still there, but they were gone. The rest of my day I didn't see them, and to my knowledge, no one followed me. That night in the hostel, I decided to brave the common room yet again. I had seen a group of girls my age, and I was hoping I could chat with them. However, sadly I never saw them, but I did end up talking to this 28-year-old Canadian guy. He was really cool, and we still follow each other on Instagram now. I saw the younger man one last time that night, and he sat at the bar talking to 2 girls. The older man, however, was nowhere in sight. Me and the man made eye contact once, but since I was with the Canadian guy, I could tell I was finally a lost cause in his mind. The next morning I took the earliest train back to Florence, and I never saw those men again. Although this story may not be the most scariest or the most eventful story ever told on this platform, it still chills me to think about. I am never one to get gut feelings, but that day, I really knew something was wrong, and I truly believe those men wanted to take me. Stay safe out there, y'all, and if you're someone like me, scared of confrontation in uncomfortable situations, Just know that if you don't stand up for yourself, it can lead to worse situations. To my fellow solo travel girls, always be on guard and stay safe. This story always gives me the chills whenever I think about it. It was Halloween. My group of friends and I, which included Jack, Luke, and Chris, were going trick-or-treating. We were going around the whole neighborhood, and we went pretty far away from our own houses. And we ended up finding this one house that looked a little bit creepy. It kind of looked abandoned, but we knocked on the door anyways. Well, an old creepy man then stepped out. We said trick or treat, and the guy then said that he didn't have any candy on his person. But if we come inside, he's got a lot of candy in the house. Now, my friends and I were around 11 to 12 years old at the time. So we decided to not go inside his house, and we told him no thanks, then moved on. Shortly after we started walking, we had then heard an engine start. We didn't really think too much of it though, and we just kept on walking. And then one of my friends, Jack, had looked back. He saw that this white van started to drive towards us. It was really weird, but we didn't want to think too much of it, until the white van slowed down right next to us, and when we looked at the windows, they were all tinted. Well, the windows started rolling down, and it was the same guy from the house from earlier. He was looking at us, and he said that he had a bunch of candy back at his house, and he was once again trying to persuade us to go into his house. He then started saying things like, "Come on, you guys are really missing out. Come on, get in my van and I'll take you to my house." Yeah, like hell we were going to do that. We weren't going to be stupid like that, so we said no thank you. Luke then squinted his eyes, and he started to look a bit more into the windows. That's when we all saw that there was another person in the passenger seat, and the guy kept persisting for us to get in the van. Luke had started getting a little too close to the van, and well, what happened next absolutely terrified all of us. The guy grabbed his arm and actually started trying to pull Luke into the van. Luke then immediately started screaming until the guy finally let go and drove away. As you can all imagine, we wrapped up trick-or-treating after that. I really wish I could say that's the end of the story, but it isn't. So the next day, we had actually foolishly decided to go back to the guy's house. But when we went back to the guy's house, the van wasn't in the driveway, and the door to the house was actually wide open. Like the stupid kids we were, we went inside the house to explore a bit. It was a 2-story house. We explored the downstairs first, and the house looked really abandoned. There was a ton of garbage all over the floor, as well as a foul odor. We managed to make it through the first floor, and we didn't really find anything. Then we went to the second floor, and we didn't really find anything there either. It was honestly kind of boring, until we then heard an engine pull into the driveway. We saw that there was a window that looked out into the front of the house, and we had peered through said window, and we saw that the white van had returned, and it was in the driveway. I then told my friends to go hide, and we did, all while hearing the footsteps coming into the house. The guy entered the house and then started screaming,
"I know you guys are in here!"
We all freaked the hell out, and I foolishly ran out of one of the rooms that I was in and then into the hallway. The guy was standing there at the end of the hallway, and I then said, "Look, we really didn't mean to trespass. We were just really curious about this house. Things just seemed really strange." The guy then looked at me and started charging at me, then actually grabbing me by my neck. I managed to scream for help before he started trying to strangle me. Right at the perfect moment, my friends came out of their hiding spot, and they then started trying to drag me downstairs and out the front door. He started dragging me towards his van. That was when my friends managed to get outside and started screaming. They all started screaming for help for him to let go of me. The guy finally let go and then jumped into his van and drove away. We ended up finding out that that house was actually abandoned and no one actually lived there. So the psychotic guy was basically using it to lure children, I guess. So yeah, we never did see him again after this experience. We also didn't tell our parents because we were just really afraid that we were all going to get in trouble for trespassing. And from what we know, since we never did see or hear from him again, he was never caught. Look, everyone, especially kids out there when trick-or-treating, please be careful. And don't do what we did and trespass into some random house that you have no idea what's going on there. Just don't do it. I hope you all enjoyed these stories. If you ever want to submit your own, you can do so at southerncannibal.com. Have a good night, everyone. And remember to always stay home.